Welcome to this episode of Great Cities and Institutions. Today, we are going to look at the history of Venice, a city with no farmland, no fresh water, no stone, and no solid ground, which somehow became the wealthiest state in Europe and ran the Mediterranean for 500 years. Every week on this channel, we step inside the great cities, empires, and institutions that shaped the world we still live in today, tracing not just when they rose, but why, and what it actually cost to build something meant to last forever. Some of these stories are about walls and monuments still standing. Others are about entire systems of government and belief that vanished centuries ago, yet somehow still shape how we live, how we're governed, and even the words we use, without most of us ever realizing it. Today's story belongs to a place that should not exist. It was founded by refugees on mud banks in a saltwater lagoon, on ground so unstable that nothing could be built on it without first sinking a forest into the seabed. It had no natural resources of any kind. Its inhabitants could not grow their own food. And from that position of total material poverty, it constructed a republic that lasted more than 1,000 years, outlived every rival it ever had, invented financial and governmental instruments still in use today, and gave the English language at least two words you have almost certainly used this year. This is the secret history of Venice. How a refugee camp in a swamp became a superpower, how it built a constitution designed with an almost paranoid genius to prevent any one man from ever seizing control, how it sacked the greatest Christian city in the world for money, and how, after 1100 years, it voted itself out of existence in a single afternoon without a shot being fired. Let's begin with the mud, because everything else follows from it. The Venetian lagoon is a shallow body of salt water on the northeastern coast of Italy, separated from the Adriatic by a chain of long, narrow sandbars. It is roughly 50 kilometers long, mostly no more than a couple of meters deep, and threaded with channels that shift. Within it are hundreds of small islands of compacted silt, deposited over millennia by rivers coming down from the Alps. Nobody wanted to live there. It was malarial. It had no fresh water, no arable soil, and no defensible high ground. It was the sort of place fishermen and salt gatherers used and left. What drove people into it was terror. As the Western Roman Empire disintegrated through the 5th century, the wealthy Roman cities of the northeastern Italian mainland, places like Aquileia, Padua, and Altino, came under successive waves of invasion. Attila and the Huns came through in the mid-5th century. The Ostrogoths came. And then, in 568, the Lombards arrived and stayed. Each time, people fled, and some of them fled to the one place the invading cavalry could not follow, out into the water. On the mud banks, in reed huts, among the channels that only local boatmen could navigate, they were safe in a way no walled city on the mainland could offer. Venetian tradition assigns the city an exact founding moment, the 25th of March, 421, the Feast of the Annunciation. That is almost certainly a later invention, designed to give this city a dignified birthday, and a sacred one. The reality was a gradual, messy, decades-long process in which temporary refuges became permanent settlements as the refugees realized there was nothing left to go back to. But that origin shaped everything that followed. Venice was not a Roman city that survived. It was a city founded by people running from the collapse of the Roman world, on ground nobody else valued, and it never forgot that it had been made rather than inherited. Now the engineering, because this is the part that genuinely deserves the word extraordinary. You cannot build a stone palace on silt. The mud of the lagoon will not carry weight. But beneath the silt, several meters down, there is a layer of dense, compacted clay that Venetians call Coranto, and that layer will carry weight. So the Venetian method was this: drive wooden piles down through the mud until they reach or bite into the Coranto, pack tightly together, sometimes only centimeters apart. Lay horizontal timber platforms across the tops of the piles. Then build on the platforms, using a lightweight brick construction rather than heavy stone wherever possible, and using Istrian limestone, which is dense and water-resistant, for the parts that meet the water. The timber came from the forests of the Alps and the Balkans, floated down rivers to the lagoon: alder, oak, larch, and elm. And here is the counterintuitive part that makes the whole city possible. Submerged wood does not rot. Rot requires oxygen and the microorganisms that use it, and in the anaerobic mud of the lagoon those organisms cannot survive. Over centuries, the piles absorb minerals from the water and harden. They do not decay. They petrify. The scale of this is difficult to hold in the mind. The Basilica of Santa Maria della Salute, built in the 17th century, is recorded as resting on well over 1 million wooden piles. The Rialto Bridge stands on many thousands. Under the entire city there is a submerged forest, driven into the seabed by hand, one trunk at a time. Venice is not built on water. Venice is built on trees, upside down, in the dark. Politically, the early lagoon settlements were nominally subjects of the Byzantine Empire, which still held territory in Italy. The chief official the Byzantines recognized carried the Latin title dux, meaning leader or duke. In the Venetian dialect that became doge. And here the story turns, because Byzantium was far away and getting weaker, and Venice was becoming rich. Trade was the only option available. Venice had salt, which it produced from the lagoon and which was a genuine commodity of value, and it had fish, and it had boats and men who knew how to handle them. It had nothing else, which meant that everything the Venetians ate, wore, or built with had to be bought. A city that must buy everything becomes very good at selling, and Venice sat at the top of the Adriatic, at the junction between the Byzantine east and the German-speaking lands north over the Alps. By the 9th century the Doge was functionally an independent ruler, and Venice was acting in its own interests. Which brings us to the theft. Venice had wealth and it had ships, but it lacked something every important medieval city was expected to have: a major saint. Relics were not decorative in this period. They conferred prestige, drew pilgrims, and asserted a city's standing in the Christian world. So in the year 828, according to the Venetian account, 2 Venetian merchants named Bono de Malamaco and Rustico de Torcello went to Alexandria in Egypt, then under Muslim rule, and removed the body of Saint Mark the Evangelist from its resting place. The detail that has kept this story alive for 12 centuries concerns how they got it out. The relics, the account goes, were packed into a basket and covered over with layers of pork. When Muslim customs officials came to inspect the cargo, they saw and smelled pork, which their religion forbade them to touch, and waved the shipment through without examining it. Whether that happened as described is impossible to establish, and the story has obvious value as propaganda. It makes the theft into a clever act of piety rather than a robbery. What is certain is that from that point St. Mark was Venice's patron. The great basilica was raised beside the Doge's palace to hold him, and the winged lion of St. Mark became the emblem of the Venetian state, stamped on its coins, carved on its buildings, and raised over every port it ever controlled. Now let's talk about the Constitution, because this is Venice's real masterpiece, and it is far less known than its canals. The Venetians were obsessed with a single fear, that one man, or one family, would seize the state. They had watched it happen everywhere else in Italy, where city after city fell into the hands of a signore, a strong man who took power and made it hereditary. Venice was determined that it would not happen there, and it built a system of such deliberate, layered complexity that it very largely worked for over 5 centuries. The Doge was elected for life, and he was not permitted to name his successor. That alone was unusual. But the election process the Venetians eventually settled on, formalized in 1268, is one of the strangest and cleverest pieces of institutional design in European history. It worked roughly like this. From the Great Council, 30 members were chosen by lot. Those 30 were reduced by lot to 9. The 9 elected 40. Those 40 were reduced by lot to 12. The 12 elected 25. The 25 were reduced by lot to 9. The 9 elected 45. Those 45 were reduced by lot to 11. The 11 elected 41. And those 41, finally, elected the Doge, requiring a supermajority. That is 10 stages, alternating between random selection and election. It sounds absurd, and it was entirely rational. The alternation is the point. A faction can bribe electors, but it cannot bribe a lottery. A faction can win a vote, but it cannot predict which of its members will survive the next drawing of lots. By alternating chance and choice 10 times over, the Venetians made it effectively impossible to control the outcome through either corruption or organization. It is a system designed by people who assumed, correctly, that everyone involved would cheat if they could. And once elected, the Doge was hemmed in on every side. Before each new Doge took office, a commission reviewed the conduct of the previous one and added new restrictions to the ducal oath, the permission ducale, closing whatever loophole the last man had found. That oath was then read aloud to the new Doge, who swore to it. The accumulated restrictions became remarkable. The Doge could not open diplomatic correspondence alone. He could not meet foreign envoys privately. He could not leave the city without permission. He could not engage in trade on his own account. His sons were barred from certain offices. His family's marriages could be regulated. He could not display his personal coat of arms in public places. He could not accept gifts beyond token items. And after his death, a commission investigated his conduct, and his estate could be fined for any violations found. The Doge was the state's face, its symbol, and its permanent presence. He was almost never its master. Around him sat the machinery, the Great Council, which held sovereignty and eventually numbered well over 1,000 men, the Senate, which handled foreign policy and finance, the Signoria and the ducal councillors, who monitored the Doge daily, and from 1310, the Council of Ten. The Ten were created in response to a conspiracy led by a nobleman named Bahamonte Tiepolo, and they were meant to be temporary. They became permanent, and they became the most feared institution in the Republic, a security council with sweeping powers over state secrets, conspiracies, and threats to the Constitution, operating with speed and secrecy that the larger bodies could not manage. It is from this apparatus that one of Venice's more unsettling images comes, the Bocche di Leone, the lion's mouths. These were stone letterboxes set into walls around the city, carved as faces with open mouths, into which any citizen could post an anonymous written denunciation of another. In practice, the authorities imposed rules requiring corroboration before acting on an unsigned accusation, but the boxes are still there in the stonework, and the message they sent was permanent: the state is listening, and your neighbor may be talking. Alongside the Constitution, Venice built something equally important: the arsenal. The arsenal was the state shipyard, and it was arguably the largest industrial complex in Europe before the Industrial Revolution. At its height, it covered a substantial portion of the city, was enclosed by its own walls, and employed something in the order of 16,000 workers. What made it revolutionary was not its size but its method. Ships moved through the facility along a channel, stopping at stations where standardized, pre-manufactured components were fitted: hulls, then decks, then masts, rigging, oars, weapons, and stores. Because the parts were made to standard patterns, any component fitted any hull of that class. That is a production line, several centuries before the phrase existed. At full mobilization, the arsenal could reportedly turn out a fully equipped war galley in a single day, and there is a famous account of a visiting king watching a galley completed between the start and end of a banquet. Dante had visited it, and put it into the Inferno, using the boiling pitch of the Venetian shipyards as his image for one of the circles of hell. The commercial system was equally systematic. The state built great merchant galleys and auctioned the right to sail them on fixed routes, in convoys called the Mutta, which departed on set dates for Alexandria, Beirut, Constantinople, the Black Sea, North Africa, and eventually Flanders and England. Convoy sailing meant protection from pirates and from rivals. Fixed schedules meant merchants across Europe could plan around them. Venetians also developed the colleganza, a contract in which one party supplied capital and another traveled with the goods and did the trading, with profits divided according to agreed proportions and losses shared. It allowed a man with no money but with skill and nerve to enter trade, and it allowed a wealthy man to spread his capital across many voyages rather than risking it all on one. It is, in essence, an early venture capital instrument. Two more pieces of the commercial machine are worth naming. The first is salt, which sounds trivial and was not. Salt was the only way to preserve food at scale, which made it strategic, and Venice had it in quantity from the lagoon pans. But the Republic went further than selling its own. It bought up salt from producers around the Mediterranean and worked to control the supply reaching northern Italy, subsidizing merchants who carried Venetian salt so competitors could not undercut them. It is one of the earliest examples of a state deliberately engineering a commodity monopoly as policy, and the profits help finance the fleet. The second is a book. In the 1290s, a Venetian merchant named Marco Polo was, according to the traditional account, a prisoner of the Genoese, and dictated an account of his travels in Asia to a fellow captive, a writer of romances named Rustichello de Pisa. The resulting work, describing the court of Kublai Khan and the wealth of China, became one of the most widely copied books of the Middle Ages. Historians have long argued about how much Polo saw himself and how much Rustichello embroidered. What is not in dispute is its effect. It gave Europe a picture of the scale and richness of Asia, and Christopher Columbus owned a copy and annotated it heavily in the margins. A Venetian merchant's travel book helped send Spanish ships west across the Atlantic, toward the trade routes that would eventually ruin Venice. And in 1284 Venice began minting the gold ducat. Its weight and purity were held constant for over 500 years, which made it trusted from London to Cairo. A currency nobody debases becomes the currency everybody uses, and the ducat became the international standard of the Mediterranean world. Now we come to the episode that Venice has never been able to explain away. In 1201, the leaders of the Fourth Crusade came to Venice to arrange transport to Egypt. Venice agreed to build and crew an enormous fleet, and quoted a price based on the number of men the Crusaders said they would bring. Venice then suspended most of its commercial activity for a year to build the ships. When the Crusaders assembled, only about a third of the expected number arrived, and they could not pay anything close to the agreed sum. The Doge was Enrico Dandolo. He was somewhere around 90 years old, and he was blind. He was also one of the most formidable political operators of the medieval world. Dandolo did not release the Crusaders from the debt. He offered a deferral, in exchange for services. First, the crusade was diverted to attack Zara on the Dalmatian coast, a Christian city that had thrown off Venetian control. The Crusaders took it, and the Pope excommunicated the participants for making war on fellow Christians. Then, drawn on by a Byzantine claimant who promised money and troops if restored to the throne, the fleet sailed to Constantinople. The promised payment never materialized in full. Relations collapsed. And in April of 1204, a Christian crusading army stormed and sacked the greatest Christian city in the world. The destruction was catastrophic. Churches were stripped, libraries burned, relics and treasures carried off, the population brutalized over 3 days. The Byzantine Empire was carved up among the victors, and Venice took, in the famous formula, a quarter and half a quarter of the empire, the ports, islands, and harbors that mattered, chosen with a merchant's precision rather than a conqueror's greed. Among the loot were 4 bronze horses, taken from the Hippodrome of Constantinople and set above the entrance to the Basilica of St. Mark, where copies stand today with the originals preserved inside. Venice emerged from the Fourth Crusade as a genuine maritime empire, the Stato de Mar, Crete, Corfu, the Dalmatian coast, ports across the Aegean, and later Cyprus. The Byzantine Empire never recovered, and its weakening in 1204 is part of the long chain that ends with the Ottoman conquest in 1453. There is no charitable reading of this. It was a debt collection carried out with an army, against a Christian city, by a state that then decorated its cathedral with the proceeds. Venice's great rival through this period was Genoa, and the two republics fought a series of wars over trade routes across more than a century. The most dangerous came in 1379, when Genoese forces took Chioggia at the southern edge of the lagoon and came close to strangling Venice at home. The Venetians, in a desperate reversal, blockaded the blockaders in the shallow channels they knew better than anyone and forced to surrender. Genoa never seriously threatened them again. Now let me give you the two words, because Venice contributed both to the languages of Europe, and both come from institutions. The first is quarantine. Venice, as a port receiving ships from Alexandria, Beirut, and the Black Sea, was catastrophically exposed to plague, and it worked out earlier than most that disease arrived with ships. In 1423 it established a facility on an island in the lagoon, the Lazaretto Vecchio, generally regarded as the first permanent purpose-built plague hospital in Europe. Arriving vessels suspected of infection were held offshore, with crew, passengers, and cargo isolated before entry. The isolation period was set at 40 days. In Venetian, 40 days is 40 giorni. The word quarantine comes directly from that period of enforced waiting in the Venetian lagoon, and it entered every major European language. The second word is ghetto. In 1516, the Venetian government required the city's Jewish residents to live in a designated, enclosed area, on an island in the Cannaregio district, with gates locked at night and guarded. The area had previously been the site of a copper foundry, and the Venetian word for foundry, ghetto, gave the district its name. That word traveled, and it became the general term for a segregated urban quarter, applied first across Europe and eventually worldwide. The Venetian arrangement was restrictive and discriminatory, and it should be described plainly as such. It confined a population, imposed curfews, limited occupations, and required distinguishing dress. At the same time, the historical record is genuinely more complicated than a simple picture allows, because Venice permitted a Jewish community to live, worship, and trade within its territory at a time when England, France, Spain, and Portugal had expelled their Jewish populations entirely. The community built 5 synagogues in the district, several of which survive, and it produced significant scholarship and printing. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and any account that gives you only one of them is not giving you the history. Venice's industrial secrets were guarded with equal seriousness. In 1291 the Republic ordered the glass furnaces moved to the island of Murano, the official reason being fire risk in a city built substantially of timber. The effect, and very probably a second intention, was to concentrate the glassmakers where they could be watched. Murano developed Cristallo, a nearly colorless glass of remarkable clarity, and Venetian glass dominated the European market. Glassmakers enjoyed high status and privileges, and were also restricted from leaving with their knowledge. Stories that defectors were hunted down and killed circulate widely and are not well documented. What is documented is that the state treated the technique as a strategic asset. Venice also became the printing capital of Europe. Within decades of the technology arriving, the city held hundreds of presses and was producing an enormous share of all books printed on the continent. The greatest of its printers was Aldus Manutius, whose Aldine press published careful editions of the Greek and Latin classics, introduced italic type, standardized aspects of punctuation including the modern semicolon, and crucially, produced books in a small octavo format designed to be carried rather than placed on a lectern. That last innovation matters more than it sounds. Aldus invented the portable book, and in doing so changed who could own one and where reading could happen. So how does a state like this decline? Not through conquest. Through geography. 2 dates matter. In 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, and the eastern Mediterranean became an Ottoman sea in which Venice traded on someone else's terms and fought a long series of costly wars. And in 1498, Vasco da Gama reached India by sailing around the southern tip of Africa. That second event was fatal in slow motion. The entire Venetian commercial system rested on being the indispensable middleman between Asia and Europe, taking eastern goods that had crossed overland to Alexandria or Beirut and distributing them north and west. A sea route from Lisbon to India that never touched the Mediterranean removed the middleman from the equation. Venice adapted, fought, and endured for centuries more, but the center of gravity of world trade had shifted to the Atlantic, and no amount of institutional brilliance could move it back. Cyprus was lost to the Ottomans in 1571. Crete was lost in 1669, after a siege of the city of Candia that lasted 21 years, one of the longest in recorded history. The 18th century Venice most people picture, the Venice of masks and casinos and Casanova, is Venice in its long twilight, a state that had stopped being a power and had become a destination, living on its own reputation, selling the experience of itself to the young aristocrats of Northern Europe on the Grand Tour. Carnival ran for months. Foreign visitors described a city of extraordinary beauty and equally extraordinary decadence. The end came on the 12th of May, 1797. Napoleon Bonaparte, campaigning in northern Italy, had no use for Venetian neutrality and every use for Venetian territory. Faced with French forces at the edge of the lagoon and no realistic means of resistance, the Great Council of Venice met. They voted to dissolve the Republic. The tally was 512 in favor, 20 against, 5 abstaining. The council did not have a legal quorum. It voted anyway. The last Doge, Ludovico Menon, removed the corno ducale, the distinctive ducal cap that had crowned 120 of his predecessors, and handed it to his attendant. The words attributed to him are among the saddest in European history. He is said to have remarked that they should take it away, as it would not be needed again. 1100 years of continuous Republican government ended in an afternoon, by a vote, without a battle. Napoleon did not even keep it. By the Treaty of Campo Formio, signed later that year, Venice was traded to Austria in exchange for territory elsewhere. It changed hands again, and finally joined the new Kingdom of Italy in 1866. Today, Venice faces threats its founders would have found bitterly familiar and entirely new at once. The city is sinking slowly, through natural subsidence and, historically, through groundwater extraction on the mainland. The sea is rising. The high waters known as Acqua Alta have grown more frequent, and the flood of November 1966, and again the exceptional flooding of 2019, caused severe damage. A system of mobile flood barriers at the lagoon inlets, known as MOS, was begun in 2003, took far longer and cost far more than planned, and has been raised operationally in recent years. There is also a quieter crisis. The resident population of the historic center has fallen dramatically, from something in the order of 175,000 in the middle of the 20th century to well under 60,000. As housing has shifted to short-term tourist accommodation and ordinary life has become impractical. Tens of millions of visitors arrive each year. The city that once had to import everything now struggles to keep its own inhabitants. And beneath all of it, holding all of it up, the forest is still there. Under Santa Maria della Salute, more than 1 million tree trunks, cut in the Alps, floated down rivers, and driven point first into the mud of a lagoon by men working from boats, 3.5 centuries ago. Petrified now, mineralized, hard as stone, in the black anaerobic silt where nothing rots. The refugees who came to the lagoon had no land, no stone, no water, no grain, and no army. They had boats, salt, and the fact that nobody else wanted the place. They built a state that outlasted the empire that spawned it, the empire that rivaled it, and every republic in Europe, and they built it upside down, in the dark, on trees. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it a like, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of the great cities, empires, and institutions that built the world we live in. Leave a comment below telling us which city or institution you would like us to explore next.